Welcome back everyone, Jacob Hess here, your instructor and mentor, and welcome to the Securing Cisco Network Devices lesson. So we've gone all this time without setting up any passwords or usernames or anything like that. We haven't even configured SSH yet. So this lesson is all about that. And we've waited all the way until the end to do this because, man, it would be a pain to type in a password every time we did any lab, right? But now you're going to learn how to configure these passwords and whatnot. And in the real world, you will always be inputting passwords before you can configure anything because we need to secure our devices. So that's what we're going to be talking about. We'll start out by just discussing the different access methods for our devices to remind you about that. And then we'll look at how we secure the console port on our device, how we can secure the command line on our device, and how we can secure the remote access to the device. So let's get started. Oh, and we'll also do a lab at the end. So here we go. The device access methods are: first, we have local access. This is when we're configuring a device via the console port when we take it out of the box. So if we receive this router from our vendor, we would get basically the router out of the box, plug it into power, turn it on, and then we plug in that console line in order to configure the console, or in order to connect to the device, to locally configure it. So that's not password protected or anything by default. So this is one access method that we do need to protect. Another access method is remote access. So we can remotely access our routers and switches using Telnet or SSH, right? Over the network. That's another way we can get access over the VTY lines in this case instead of the console line. We can get access to the VTY lines remotely to configure the device. So we need to password protect those and secure the VTY lines as well. So these are the two different main kind of access methods where we can get to our device to configure it and change it. So again, we need to secure that. So our first thing we're going to look at is securing the console. So again, when we're securing the console port, what we're doing is we're securing that port that is by default open for us to configure devices when we take them out of the box. So that is the console port here. The little blue port, I know you've seen this before, but I just want to make sure that you understand what we're talking about. It can be in different places on different devices. Here we have a switch. The console port is right here. It's got two different versions of console. It's got an RJ45 and also a micro USB. Then we have, or that's a mini USB. And then we have, this one's on a router here. You can see the console port looks a little bit different. It's still got the blue though, signifying it. And we configure them with the blue, light blue cable from Cisco, the Cisco console cable. So just reminding you about that. Okay, we need to secure this console port, guys. All right. So we can set actually a password on the console line to begin securing the device. And this is how we do it. We just go line console 0. We'd type in the word password and whatever password we want. And then we just type login. And actually that makes it so that anytime we try to log into the console line, it's going to ask us for a password. We also have this exec timeout. Because our console line will stay active until it times out, we can disable the timeout by using the no exec timeout or exec timeout 0. But the default is 10 minutes. And we want to have a timeout on there. We don't want to disable it actually, because when we unplug from our console, sometimes we forget to exit the session. And if we do forget that, we need to rely on this exec timeout to close that session for us so that somebody can't just come behind us and plug in a console port and get unrestricted access into the device. So again, we need to set our password on that console line, and how we do that is just going into the console and setting the password and typing the login command. So it will prompt for the console password at login. Now I'm going to go ahead and bring up our lab for an example. This is the lab that we're actually going to be using. But you can see here we have a console going into the router here, but we could move that console into the switch. I already have the switch configured. I'm going to go to the console of the switch. I'm going to open up the computer here, and I'm going to go over to the desktop and go to the terminal. So this is like if we were using PuTTY or something, to PUTTY, to configure that console port. Here's actually the settings to connect to the console port, 9600, 8 none, 1 none. These are the normal settings to connect to a Cisco device. And so we can console in here in Packet Tracer, and you see it's asking me for a password to get in. So that's the console password. It also works here. Let's see. Actually, let me reconnect that console port. If I can grab it there it is, reconnect it over to the router for you. You guys will be consoling into that guy. But if we're using Packet Tracer and we just bring up the terminal here, the CLI, this is also like a console, and you see it's asking me for a password. It never did that before, right? So that's the console password. It's protecting that local access to the device. And there's one more thing. We can also configure a local username and password database, meaning that here we can just set a password and we'll get that password prompt like we saw, like we just did. But we could also set a username and password on the router, and instead of getting just a single password, we'd be prompted for the username and password. So that's another way we can set our login. So we'll look at both of those methods. And once we get the username and password set, all we need to do is go into that line and type login local instead of just login. Login local will prompt us to use that local username database. Just login uses the password we set. So that's securing the console port. Next, we need to look at securing the command line. So we know that we have these different line levels, right? We have user exec mode. Whenever we log into the device, that's the first mode we're in, user exec. Then we type the enable command to go to privileged exec mode. And then we have the global configuration mode too. So what I'm getting at is we want to protect these higher line levels, like the privileged exec mode. And we do this with something called the enable password or the enable secret. The enable secret command sets the same password as enable password does, but the enable secret command encrypts it by default. So we always want to use the enable secret. It encrypts it inside the running config or the startup config. So we use the enable secret command to set our globally encrypted password to protect access to privileged exec. So let me go ahead and show you that. We are actually consoling into that switch again. And I'm going to go ahead and put in the password for the console. And now if I type the enable command, it's going to ask me for another password. This is what the enable secret does. It protects me moving from user exec into privilege exec. So if I type in the password here for that, which is actually nextgen secret, I forgot it for a second there. Nextgen secret, and now I'm in. See? So we have two layers of password protection, one to access the console line and then another one to access privileged exec mode. We need these passwords, ladies and gents. And here's how we would configure it. You just go into global configuration mode and type enable secret and then the password. We also can set password encryption. It's called service password encryption. This is a global config command that will encrypt all the passwords in our configuration, and that's service password encryption. And why that's important is because I've just done a show run here, and you can see by default we have some passwords that are unencrypted. This is my username, and actually I'm just going to do service password -encryption command, and now when I do a show run, you see it's encrypted my passwords. So if I had any other unencrypted passwords, it would encrypt them for me. So now our password we had set for the username is encrypted too. Service password encryption. That's important for securing our command line. And we also have this thing called the local username database that we've been talking about thus far. Basically, this is just creating a list of usernames and passwords, and they can have different privilege levels too, which we'll talk about. But this is how you input the local username. You would just go username, name, and then password, and the password. There are other options, however. Here is the switch we're just looking at, and you can see here username, the username, and then password, and we can put in the password. But you can see there's other options. Here we have privilege level 1. I'm going to actually change this to username admin privilege 15. See how we can set our different levels of privilege? It doesn't show us here for some reason. Oh, it's because I'm not in global configuration mode. Username admin privilege, and we can say 15. That's the highest level. That's what I want. And I'm going to input the unencrypted password. To do that, you can say password 0, or you can say just password, and you can put it in. And that will be just nextgen. So now if we do a show run, that should have replaced the previous one. But since, yeah, see, now it's privilege level 15. But since I had service password encryption, it automatically encrypted that password for me. Now we could add more of these usernames. We could have multiple users on our devices if we want. Now we can also set a username and password database that is outside of the router and somewhere else on the network. But that's outside of the scope of ICND1. That'll be ICND2 material. Alright, so that's that local username and password database. And we also need to know that there are a bunch of different privilege levels, basically. So let's talk about the privilege levels. There's 3 main levels, and you were just seeing how we could assign privilege level 15 or level 1 to our username whenever we set it up. But there's actually also a 0 level. So the 0 level, there's only 5 commands available. They can just log out, they can type enable or disable help and exit. So pretty much nothing. User level 1 is read-only access. This is like user exec mode. Then we have privilege level, which is 15. This will allow us to do anything. It's unrestricted completely. But the cool thing here is the levels between 1 and 15 can actually be customized, and we can set specific commands that can be done in these different levels. We're not going to do that in ICND1. That's a little more advanced. But just letting you know, it's pretty robust as to how we can build the security of our system. And that wraps up securing the command line. And let's go ahead and talk about remote access, and then we'll jump into the lab. So we have these different types of remote access. We have VTY line, which could be accessed via Telnet or SSH. So we need to set a password on that VTY line, and we do that pretty much the same way as our console line, except now instead of typing line console 0, we're typing line VTY. Now on our switches and on our routers, if we do a show running config, the VTY lines and that console line will be all the way at the bottom of the config. So I went ahead and scrolled all the way down to the bottom, and you can see here is all of our VTY lines and our console line. Now you see that there's 0 through 15. This is actually 16 lines. So on a switch, this is the way it is by default. There's 15 lines. And so we type line VTY 015 password in the password, and then login or login local, whatever we want to do. If we want to use our username and database, or if we want to just log in using the local password. Alright, so you see on the console line we're using the local password, and on the VTY lines here we're actually looking at the local username database. So you can set it however you want. Anyhow, point is, if you scroll all the way down, that's where all your lines are. The switch has 0 through 15, but the router has a different number by default. We can add more lines, but the router, if we go ahead and go to the router, I haven't set any passwords on it yet, but if we do a show run on the router, you see there's only 5 VTY lines by default. So in the router, you can just type line VTY 0 space 4, and you can get in there to configure that. Alright, cool. So that's setting our password on our VTY lines, but we can also tell it to use that local username database for our logins as well. If we wanted to do that, we would type login local instead of just login. And here are our 2 different ways to access these VTY lines. We have Telnet and we have SSH. So first with Telnet is it's unencrypted, right? But we can just type Telnet on our host and connect to our host. Since we have put in a password on our VTY lines, we should be able to just Telnet right over to that device. So we could bring up any host, and we could go over to our desktop, go over to command prompt, and just type Telnet, and let's try to Telnet to the switch. Boom. It's asking me for the username because I actually have login local set, and the password, which I set as nextgen. And now I'm in through a straight Telnet session. And that's all fine and dandy, but the thing is, this session is completely unencrypted. So if I was to type any commands on this device, no matter what it is, even if it was a password, it's going to be sent across this Telnet session unencrypted. And anyone could snoop on this connection between me and the switch, or this host computer and the switch, and they could just run Wireshark or something and pull every single thing that I'm typing. So instead of using that, we want to use something that's more secure. Okay, and what is that thing that's more secure? That is SSH. So it's better for us to configure SSH on the device. Now to do that, we have to have a host name and a domain name. So at a minimum, we need to have a host name set, which we do on this switch, you see. And by domain name, let's do a show run. Well, actually, I don't need to. It's right here already on the screen from my previous show run. It's the IP domain name command. It utilizes the host name and the domain name for some specific stuff when setting up SSH. So we need that, and then we can do the crypto key generate command where we generate these crypto keys, and then we just change our SSH version to version 2, and we're all set and hunky-dory on accessing our device via SSH. Enabling SSH. So, ladies and gents, that wraps up all the information you needed to know. And now, we can dive into our lab. So you can open up the packet tracer file called securingdevices.pkt. And what we're going to do here is the following things. We're going to secure the console, secure the command line, and the remote access, all for our router. Remember that switch, it was already configured. So we're going to do all this for the router. All right, and I'll bring over my packet tracer lab here. And in your lab, you should have it set like this, or you should have this text here telling you that the switch already has basic security. The switch already has basic security configured, but the router does not. So we need to configure the router with basic security. So let's hop in here and let's start rolling out the configuration. All right. So we're going to start by securing our console line. We're going to go into global configuration mode and just say line console 0, and we'll put in a password. We're going to put in our password nextgent console, and then just say login. Now we're going to use a different password for each area. For one, it's best practice, and for two, it's going to help you understand what's going on. But I have all the passwords we're going to be using. They're here at the top. We have 4 different ones: the enable secret, the console password, the VTY line password, and the username admin password that we set. So here we have now secured our console line, and we can go ahead and verify that by going over to this host who has a console connection, and we can go to the terminal and we can try to start that console session. Oh, this host was already logged in, so I'm exiting out. Now it's asking me for the password. So we know that worked right. And the password was nextgent console, and now it's let me in to the router. So that's kind of small. I know it's hard to see this terminal, but it is the full-blown thing. All right, so that worked, but that's how you can check it, guys. Once you get your console configured, you can go to the terminal. You just got to make sure you have a console cable connected to the console port of the router. See, we're connecting into the console port. Boom. All right. So that configured our console port. We have now protected that, and I have to type nextgent console to get in. That's good. Now let's secure the command line. Let's go into global configuration mode and do that enable secret command. Remember, there's also an enable password command. I'm going to use the question mark here, and you'll see we can do a password which is unencrypted or secret which is encrypted, and we're going to choose secret always. Enable secret nextgent secret. That's what I'm using for the password. Make sure you're spelling nextgent right when you're configuring this, otherwise you're going to lock yourself out, ladies and gents. Make sure you spell it right there. N-E-X-G-E-N-T, secret. All right. Yeah, you can lock yourself out if you don't know these passwords. So we've set our enable secret to nextgent. Now what we can do is we can type disable here at the prompt. It'll bring us back to our user exec mode. Then we can type enable, and now look at that. We have a password to enter. Nextgent secret. Right, so now we've protected our privileged exec mode. Sweet. Let's save our config. Copy running config, startup config. Oh, what happened there? Startup config. There we go. And now we have our command line protected, our privileged exec mode, but let's also set that password encryption. We'll do service password encryption. Right? It's a great command we always need to add as part of our config. And now let's go ahead and set up that remote access security. So we're going to go into our VTY lines. Now remember, we can do a show run and go all the way down to the bottom to see our VTY lines. 0 through 4. So let's go line VTY 0 space 4, and we'll do password nextgent VTY, and then we'll do login. So now when someone tries to telnet to the device, they're going to be prompted for the password. The password nextgent VTY we set. Let's test that. We could just use this local machine because it's consoled in, but it's also connected into the network. So let's go over to, the local machine. And we'll go to the command prompt. Yes. And that's where we need to do our telnet from. So from our command prompt here, we can just type telnet 192.168.100.1, which is the router IP address, which we've conveniently also put here. And it's asking me for that password, nextgent VTY. You have to type the right password. Now I'm going to type enable, and now what's this password going to be? Nextgent secret. All right, now we're in. But remember, this telnet session is completely unencrypted. So let's set up SSH instead, ladies and gents. There's also ways where we can lock our router and switch down to where they can't use telnet. That's also a little outside this scope. But let's go ahead and get our configuration done for SSH after we set up our username and password, our local username and password. So let's go back to our router. That's where we need to go. So we're going to set now a username and password on the router itself instead of just using these local passwords. So we're going to go T and we'll do username admin and we'll do password nextgent. That's all the password's going to be. Let's see what privilege level it assigned that by default if it says. It doesn't say. When it doesn't say, it should be privilege level 15 there. But if it does say, Control Shift 6. But if it does say, make sure it says privilege 15. If you're trying to, or if that's the only username you have. Alright, so we have the username set. We'll do a show run, see that username. And now what we can do is go into both of our console and VTY lines. So we'll go conf t line console 0 and we'll do login local this time. Line VTY 04 login local. Now we'll see what happens when we try to log in. First, well, I guess we can start with the console since we're already here. Boom. It's asking me for the username, which was admin, and the password is nextgent. All right. Now I can type enable, and then I'm going to do nextgent secret. And now we are back into the router, and our console line was protected via the username. And we can also test that on our VTY lines. So I'm just going to open up this other host and do a telnet this time. Go to command prompt. And we'll do a telnet to 192.168.100.1, which is the router. And it's asking me for the username and that password. Alright, cool, huh? Now we have protected it with our username and password instead of just the password. Cool stuff. Okay, now let's set up SSH. So what we've done so far is we protected our console line, we protected our privilege exec mode, and we have then set a username and password locally, and now we're using that when we log into the VTY lines or the console. But we could choose whatever we want. We don't have to set the console for using that local username. In fact, I'm going to take it off. I'm just going to say, line console 0. I'm just going to put login on that one. That way we just use the password locally there, the nextgent console on that one. I see a lot of times that's what people do in the field rather than using the usernames. And just use usernames for remote access and backup local access. Okay, so now we have everything configured except for SSH. Let's go ahead and set up SSH because remember we need that if we want to have actual secure remote access, an encrypted session to the device. So we can start out by just confirming we have our host name set. I know we do because we have router 0 here. But remember, we can do a show run and look at all our config, guys. We can see I have a host name set of router 0. And we also need to confirm we have that domain name set. And if we have those, then we can generate crypto keys. Crypto key generate, RSA. It's going to ask us for the size. I'm going to do 1024 instead of 512. All right, it generated the keys. And now we can just do IP SSH version 2. Because you see, right when we generated the keys, it enabled version SSH 1.99. Let's go all the way up to version 2. That's what we want. All right. Now we have SSH configured. And instead of using Telnet, we can use SSH to connect. We have to do SSH-L and then put in the username. And then put in the destination IP, which is 192.168.100.1. That's how we're going to SSH over to it. If you guys forget how to do that on the host, you can just type SSH, and it will tell you. Packet Tracer PC SSH command. So SSH-L, and then the username. So we have to go ahead and type in admin here, 192.168.100.1. And then it's just going to prompt us for that password, nextgent, and now we're in. We still have to put in our enable secret, so even if someone hacked my username and password, they still wouldn't be able to get in unless they had this password of nextgent secret. Oops. Nextgent secret. Let me in. There we go. Finally typed it right. So that actually is it, guys. Now we have an encrypted session. We just did an SSH over to the router, and we're using those crypto keys. We have an encrypted session. We can go over to the router. We can do show SSH or show IP SSH. Actually, no, just show SSH here. Yeah, you see? And we have an in and an out. And we're using SHA-1. Anyway, we can see who's logged in there. And that's it. So we have secured our network. And did we save the config? I believe we did after all our configurations. Nextgent console. Nextgent secret. Copy, run, start. Okay. That's all. So now we're done. Check that out. Cool stuff. Now there is one more bonus thing I'd like to add real quick, because we can protect actually who can access our VTY lines by IP address. So who can actually remotely configure our device by IP. So we can create an access list to protect our VTY lines. Now in the real world, we would do this to really just allow like a management network to configure our devices. But in this case, we can do something to show this where we're just going to allow only this host 100.3 to connect to the VTY lines. So this is something good to just look at real quick within the scope of Cisco. So let's go ahead and type in our password for console access, and then our password for our enable secret, and then we're going to go in global configuration mode, and I'm just going to do an access list, IP access list standard. Standard looks at the source only, and that's all we need, is because we're only going to be testing for where things are coming from. For example, if the SSH session is coming from 100.3, it's going to allow it. We're not going to look at where it's going to. We're going to call the list VTY, and we're just going to put a statement permit host 192.168.100.3. And I'm also going to throw one more line in here. There is an implicit deny at the end of every statement, but I want to actually see the denies, so I'm going to put in a command deny any actually as line 500. And now if I do a show access list, I see I have my permit command and I have my deny. And just to show you where we're going to be putting this, we're going to put our VTY access list on the VTY lines here. And we're going to use the access class command to do that. So we'll go line VTY04, and we'll do access dash class to apply this access list, access class VTY in. All right. So if we do a show run now, we can see we've applied that access list. Now anyone who tries to connect to the VTY lines is going to be ran against this list. So let's check if our host can SSH to it. All right, our host is allowed to SSH over. And we can log in and start configuring things if we want. So it did allow this host. What happens when we try to do it from 100.2? What do you guys think? Connection refused. Refused. You refused my connection. So, okay. Now we can see how that access list works. It won't even allow the other host to try. But we were able to log in from here because we've restricted access with our VTY line access list. And that wraps up the lesson, ladies and gents. So we did look at the different types of access methods. Remember, we have our local console access method to configure the device, and then we can SSH or telnet over to our VTY lines to configure our device, our router, or our switch. It's also important for us to know how to secure that console, secure the command line, privileged exec mode, and secure our remote access with passwords and usernames, etc. And we also wrapped it up with a lab, which I don't have in my recap, but I'm sure you guys are quite aware that we just did that lab. And that's it, ladies and gents. This is Jacob Hess, your instructor and mentor. As always, thank you very much for viewing, and I'll see you in the next video.
Thank you guys for viewing the video. I hope you really enjoyed it. And I'd also like to remind you that if you're truly serious about your career in information technology, be sure to check out our Career Blueprint and Engineer Training Program at www.zerotoengineer.com.